The fluorescent lights in Principal Harrison's office hummed with the same indifferent frequency they'd hummed for 20 years. Christopher Anderson stood with his hands in his pockets, fingers brushing against the crumpled electricity bill he couldn't pay, while the woman behind the desk explained that budget cuts meant his position, substitute teacher English and history. $38,000 per year no longer existed. The words floated past him like debris in a current. He nodded. He'd known this was coming. The district had been hemorrhaging money since the pandemic, and substitutes were always first to drown. Outside in the parking lot, his phone rang before he reached the car. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Gerald Whitmore, attorney at law, calling from Hartford. Christopher's Uncle Harold had passed away 3 weeks prior. The funeral had been small, the obituary smaller. Christopher had sent flowers he couldn't afford. Now Mr. Whitmore needed him to come to the office regarding the estate. Tomorrow, if possible. There were documents requiring signature. Christopher drove home to the apartment where Rachel was doing homework at the kitchen table and Brandon was scrolling through his phone on the couch. The place smelled like the cheap pasta sauce he'd stretched across 4 dinners. He told them about the job first, watching Rachel's face fall and Brandon's jaw tighten. Then he mentioned the lawyer. Brandon looked up from his screen for the first time in an hour. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to hope. What kind of estate Uncle Harold lived in that cottage by the... Christopher cut him off before the question could finish forming. I don't know. We'll find out tomorrow. Rachel closed her math book without marking her place. At 11, she still believed in possibilities the way Brandon at 16 had stopped believing in anything that couldn't be measured. Can we come? Christopher nodded. What else could they do? It wasn't like they had school tomorrow, or rather, he didn't have work tomorrow or any tomorrow after that. The law office occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had been renovated just enough to charge premium rent without actually being premium. Gerald Whitmore's receptionist offered them coffee in paper cups while they waited in chairs that creaked under Christopher's weight. Through the walls he could hear muffled conversations about probate and tax implications. When Whitmore finally called them in, Christopher's sister Catherine was already seated, her designer bag resting against the leg of her chair like a small expensive dog. She'd worn the Armani suit, the one she saved for closings that mattered. Kenneth arrived 2 minutes later, apologizing for traffic, his insurance executive Cologne arriving 3 seconds before he did. Their father Donald came last, moving slowly, looking older than 78, looking like a man who'd spent 40 years disappointed and saw no reason to stop now. Whitmore cleared his throat and began reading. Most of the document was legal boilerplate, the kind of language designed to make simple things complicated. Harold Trinidad had possessed modest savings, a 2015 Honda Civic, and a collection of first-edition mystery novels that might fetch decent money at the right auction. These items were to be distributed among various cousins and nephews. Then Whitmore reached page 7. To my nephew Christopher Anderson, I leave my primary residence located at 1847 Riverside Lane, Riverside, Connecticut, known as Montgomery Estate, along with all structures, grounds, and appurtenances thereto. Catherine's laugh came out sharp enough to cut. Montgomery Estate, that death trap. Jesus, Harold really hated Christopher. Kenneth leaned forward, his actuarial mind already calculating. That place has been condemned, or should be. The structural liability alone. Donald said nothing. He just looked at Christopher with that same expression he'd worn when Christopher had announced his intention to become a teacher instead of something practical, something that made money. Christopher heard the words, but they seemed to arrive from a great distance. Montgomery Estate. He'd driven past it once years ago when he'd first moved to Connecticut. A Victorian mansion swallowed by vines, windows like dead eyes, a for sale sign that had faded to illegibility. Whitmore slid a manila envelope across the desk. Your uncle also left this. Instructions were to give it to you privately. Christopher took the envelope. The paper felt old, the kind that yellowed at the edges. Inside was a single handwritten letter on stationery that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. Harold's handwriting shaky but legible. Christopher, you always saw what others missed. This house needs someone like you. Don't let them make you sell it. There's something here. I never found it, but I know it's waiting. Look where the light touches the darkness. H. The meeting dissolved into arguments Christopher barely registered. Catherine knew a demolition company that worked cheap. Kenneth had researched the property's assessed value. The land was worth more than the building. Even Michelle texted him before he'd left the parking lot, her message appearing on his phone like a summons. We need to talk about this. The kids need stability, not another one of your projects. Her parents, Thomas and Patricia Kelly, had never forgiven him for what they called his lack of ambition. He could picture them now, Margaret Kelly's voice loud enough to carry across 3 states. Well, I suppose every family needs its charity case. Christopher drove to Montgomery Estate that afternoon with Rachel and Brandon. The October sun hung low and tired in the sky. The iron gates stood open, rusted hinges groaning. A demolition notice had been zip-tied to the fence, 90 days to comply with building code or face municipal demolition. Someone had already done the math for him. The estimated repair cost, printed in neat bureaucratic font, $485,000. Brandon kicked at the gravel driveway, sending pebbles skittering. How are we supposed to afford tearing this down, much less fixing it? Rachel pulled out her sketchbook. The battered thing went everywhere with her held together with tape and hope. It's not that bad, Ba. Look at the windows. The bones are still good. The mansion loomed before them, 3 stories of Victorian ambition slowly surrendering to gravity and time. The wraparound porch sagged. Paint peeled from gingerbread trim like sunburned skin. Several upper windows had been boarded over with plywood that had itself begun to rot. But the structure still stood defiant against 90 years of neglect, and when the setting sun hit the stained glass windows flanking the front door, something inside Christopher shifted. Rachel was already drawing her pencil, moving in quick, confident strokes. She'd captured the house in profile, the elegant decay, the promise beneath the ruin. A Tesla pulled up behind them, black and silent as a shark. The man who emerged wore a suit that cost more than Christopher's monthly rent. Mid-40s silver at the temples, smile calibrated for maximum trustworthiness. Mr. Anderson, Ryan Clark, I heard you inherited this place. I develop properties in the area. I'd like to make you an offer. Christopher turned, keys in hand. I haven't even been inside yet. Ryan's smile never wavered. 200,000, cash, close in 7 days. You won't get a better offer for a property in this condition. Rachel stopped drawing. Brandon stopped pretending not to listen. $200,000. More money than Christopher had seen in his entire life. More money than he'd make in 5 years if he could even find another teaching job. I need to think about it. Ryan pulled a business card from his wallet, the motion practice deficient. Of course. But don't think too long. Opportunities like this don't wait. After the Tesla disappeared down the driveway, Christopher approached the front door. The lock was old, but the key turned smoothly. Someone had oiled it recently. The door swung open on hinges that should have screamed but whispered instead. The foyer stole his breath. 20-foot ceilings. A grand staircase curving upward, mahogany banister dulled but intact. Stained glass windows casting colored light across dust motes that danced in the air like memories given form. The October sunset poured through those windows at exactly the right angle, and Rachel's gasp made him look down. Light and shadow had arranged themselves into letters on the marble floor. Not random patterns, but deliberate shapes visible only at this precise time, this precise date. The words spelled out something Christopher couldn't quite read, the letters fragmentary, incomplete. But they were there, intentional, waiting. On the hall table, dusty but deliberately placed, sat a yellowed newspaper. Riverside Chronicle, October 25, 1929. The headline screamed across the decades, Railroad Baron Vanishes. Below it, a photograph of a distinguished man in his mid-40s standing before this very house. Richard Montgomery and his family had disappeared 3 days before the stock market crash that would trigger the Great Depression. The article speculated about debts, about shame, about midnight flight to avoid creditors. But something in Richard Montgomery's photographed eyes suggested a different story. Rachel touched his arm. "Ba, can we go inside? really inside. They moved through the ground floor like archaeologists entering a tomb. The formal dining room featured a fireplace large enough to stand in its mantel, carved with what Christopher first took for decorative vines but gradually resolved into something more deliberate, mathematical symbols hidden in the organic patterns. The library's empty bookshelves still bore nail holes where hundreds of volumes had once rested, but the holes weren't random. They formed constellations: Orion, Cassiopeia, the Big Dipper. In the parlor, faded wallpaper revealed equations when Rachel photographed it with her phone's flash quadratic formulas emerging from floral patterns like ghosts from fog. Brandon started taking pictures too, his teenage cynicism cracking despite itself. "This is weird, Ba. Like intentionally weird." The kitchen belonged to the 1950s, all chrome and formica, an awkward renovation grafted onto Victorian bones. But the butler's pantry between kitchen and dining room remained untouched, a narrow room lined with cabinets and shelving designed to hide the domestic machinery of wealthy households. Christopher was examining the cabinet's solid construction dovetail joints still tight after a century when Rachel tried to move one to see behind it. The cabinet shifted more easily than it should have. Together they slid it aside, and the wall behind showed a seam Christopher had missed in the dim light. Not just a seam, a door, hidden, waiting. His hands shook as he found the catch. The door opened inward onto a space no larger than a closet, but the walls hit him like a physical force. Every surface had been carved with symbols, astronomical charts, mathematical proofs, geometric patterns that hurt to look at too long. Some of the symbols rotated on hidden pivots. Brandon touched one experimentally, and it spun with oiled precision, revealing different markings on each face. Rachel was already sketching, trying to capture the pattern. "It's a puzzle. These rotate to make something. We need to figure out the right combination." They worked for an hour before Brandon noticed the sequence. Prime numbers carved along the bottom edge. When they rotated the symbols to align with the primes, 2357A panel in the wall slid aside with a whisper of ancient mechanics. Inside the hidden compartment, a leather journal, its pages brittle with age, and a bronze fragment roughly triangular covered in etched symbols. The journal's first page bore a title in elegant script, "The Preservation Protocol." Christopher opened to a random page and read words written 95 years ago. "I have foreseen what is coming. The signs are clear to anyone willing to see. When the collapse arrives, it will be swift and merciless. I have therefore taken steps to preserve not merely wealth, but legacy. 4 keys I have hidden, where sustenance becomes wisdom, where knowledge preserves sustenance, where rest becomes reflection, where earth meets sky. Only the worthy will find them. Only the wise will understand." Brandon. Photograph every page with methodical precision. We need to show someone who knows about this stuff. The Riverside Public Library closed at 8. Christopher pulled into the parking lot at 7:45 with both kids and the journal wrapped in a plastic bag. The librarian at the desk directed them to the local history section, where an older woman with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain looked up from her computer. Margaret Scott, the nameplate read. Reference, librarian. Christopher placed the journal on her desk. "I need help understanding this. It's about Montgomery Estate." Margaret's eyes widened behind her glasses. She touched the journal like it might dissolve. "Where did you find this?" "I inherited the estate. This was hidden in a wall." Margaret stood cross to a filing cabinet, returned with a folder so thick it required both hands. Inside, newspaper clippings, photocopied letters, hand-drawn family trees, decades of research. "I've been studying Richard Montgomery for 25 years. My dissertation was on what I called the stewardship circle, 8 wealthy industrialists who created elaborate inheritance puzzles between 1880 and 1930. Richard Montgomery was one of them. But I never found concrete proof until now." She opened the journal with reverent care, reading passages Christopher had skipped. Her hands trembled slightly. "He predicted the crash. Look at this entry from 1927. He analyzed railroad freight data, declining shipments, inventory buildups. He knew what was coming 2 years before it happened. Rachel leaned over Margaret's shoulder, reading. What did he do with his money? Margaret flipped pages until she found what she wanted. According to this, he converted everything. Stocks in companies he believed would survive depression, government bonds, gold, real estate. He estimated his total wealth at $15,1929. Brandon did the math on his phone. That's like $250 million today, minimum. Margaret looked at Christopher with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Your Uncle Harold used to come here every week. He believed there was a treasure hidden in that house. He spent 20 years looking, never found anything. But he said if anyone could find it, it would be you. He said you see things others miss. The folder contained more than just Margaret's research. There were letters Richard had written to business partners, personal correspondence, even a few pages from a book he'd published in 1925, The Art of Cryptography in Modern Business. The man had been obsessed with puzzles, with hiding information in plain sight, with testing those who came after him. One letter stood out, dated September 15, 1929. My dear Thomas, I am making preparations. My wife's illness has progressed beyond what the doctors here can address. We will be leaving for Switzerland within the month. The assets have been secured for future generations, not my sister's children, who have never wanted for anything but for someone who will value wisdom over wealth. Let them prove themselves worthy. Margaret pulled out a final document, a newspaper article from October 1929. The Montgomery family had vanished from Riverside on October 23rd, leaving behind servants, unpaid bills, and a house full of furniture. Richard's wife, Catherine, had been diagnosed with a rare neurological condition. They'd fled to European specialists. The trail went cold somewhere in Geneva. Christopher looked at his children, both bent over the table, absorbed in 90-year-old mysteries. Rachel was sketching symbols from the journal, trying to decode their meaning. Brandon was cross-referencing the letter dates with stock market data on his phone. His phone buzzed. Catherine. He ignored it. It buzzed again. Kenneth. Then a text from Michelle. The kids need to know if we're keeping the house or selling it. They deserve stability. Margaret closed the journal carefully. There's a local historian named Thomas Reed. He's retired now, but he knew your uncle. He might have information Harold never shared with me. I can introduce you. Christopher gathered the journal, the fragment, the copies Margaret had made. Thank you. I need to think about what to do with this. Driving home, Rachel broke the silence. We have to try Ba. We have to find out if it's real. Brandon's response came slower, weighted with the math that never lied. Even if we find something, we can't afford to keep the house long enough to search properly. The demolition order gives us 90 days. Christopher didn't answer. He was thinking about Richard Montgomery's words, only the worthy will find them. He was thinking about Harold's letter, look where the light touches the darkness. He was thinking about that $200,000 offer and how it would solve every immediate problem while guaranteeing they'd never know what might have been. The family meeting happened the next evening because Catherine insisted and Christopher was too tired to argue. They gathered in his apartment, too small for this many people, the walls seeming to contract with the pressure of conflicting opinions. Catherine arrived first, bringing the demolition estimate she'd commissioned without asking. Kenneth followed with insurance assessments and liability calculations. Donald came last, moving like a man carved from disappointment. Catherine spread papers across the kitchen table, forcing Rachel's homework into a pile. I've contacted 3 demolition companies. Best quote is $48,000. The land is worth approximately $220,000. After fees and taxes, Christopher walks away with about $160,000. That's life-changing money. Kenneth adjusted his glasses, scanning his own documents. The structural insurance alone would be $8,000 annually. That's before liability coverage. If someone gets hurt on that property before demolition, and kids love abandoned buildings, the lawsuit could destroy you. Christopher stood by the window watching cars pass below. He could feel them waiting for his response, his surrender. I want to explore it, just for a few weeks. See what's actually there. Catherine's voice rose half an octave. Explore it, Christopher, you just lost your job. You have $12,000 in credit card debt. The electricity bill is late. What are you going to explore with hope? Donald spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years watching his oldest son choose difficult over practical. Your grandfather was a librarian. You know what your grandmother's family said about that? They said he was wasting his potential, said he should do something that made money, but he started the first public library in his county, educated 3 generations. When he died, 500 people came to his funeral. He looked at Christopher, and something in his face had changed. You're like him. I spent so long trying to make you into something else that I missed it. I'm sorry for that. He pulled an envelope from his jacket, old and carefully folded. $5,000. My savings. Use it for whatever you need. Catherine stared at her father like he'd announced a conversion to a new religion. Dad, you can't be serious. This is exactly the kind of... I'm serious. Christopher needs to do this. We support him or we don't. I choose support. The apartment felt smaller and larger at the same time. Kenneth looked at his sister, some silent negotiation happening in the space between them. Finally, he nodded. If you're doing this, do it right. I have a friend who practices estate law, Stephen Taylor. I'll call him, get you proper legal advice. Catherine gathered her papers with sharp, precise movements. Fine. If we're enabling this, I might as well help. I know property law. I know how inheritance works. I'll research what happens if you actually find something. After they left, Michelle arrived. She'd texted that she needed to talk, and Christopher had learned during their marriage that those words never preceded good news. But she surprised him. I've been watching the kids. They're different, focused, excited. Brandon hasn't looked at his phone for 6 straight hours. Rachel filled an entire sketchbook. When was the last time you saw them like this? Christopher couldn't remember. Michelle sat at the kitchen table in the chair Catherine had occupied an hour before. I thought you needed practical. I thought they needed stability. But maybe what they need is to see you fight for something meaningful. She pulled out her own notebook legal pad covered in neat handwriting. I was a paralegal before Brandon, never used the degree. But I can research trust law inheritance precedents. If you find something, we need to know who owns it. The next days blurred into a rhythm of exploration and discovery. Christopher, Rachel, and Brandon became a team, each bringing different skills to the puzzle Richard Montgomery had left behind. They worked from first light until sunset, documenting everything, photographing every symbol, mapping every room. The fragment from the butler's pantry was clearly part of something larger. The edges showed where it had been broken or cut from a hole. According to Richard's journal, there were 4 keys. Total, 4 fragments that would combine into something that would open something else. Rachel deciphered the next clue through pure artistic intuition. Where knowledge preserves sustenance kept running through her mind until she woke up at 2 in the morning with the answer. Wine cellars. Wine was sustenance. Cellars preserved. Knowledge. Books were often stored in cool, dry places like wine cellars. The estate's wine cellar ran the entire length of the house, deeper than Christopher had realized. Racks lined the walls, most empty, but some still held bottles covered in dust and spiderwebs. The bottles weren't random. Each bore a label with a year 1887, 1891, 1897, 19, 0319, 11, 1919, 1931. Brandon saw it first. Those are all prime numbers. The bottles mark prime years. They removed bottles in sequence, 1887, 1891, 1897, and heard mechanisms clicking behind the wall. After the 7th bottle, a section of the wall rotated inward, revealing a chamber no larger than a closet. Inside, another fragment, another journal entry, and a small box containing photographs of Richard's family. His wife, Catherine. His son, James, who, according to Margaret's research, had died in a railroad accident in 1927. His daughter, Eleanor, who had passed from influenza in 1923. The journal entry was dated April 1928. I have lost everything that mattered and gained nothing that does. Wealth cannot resurrect the dead or heal the dying. But perhaps it can create opportunity for those who will come after, who still have time to build lives of meaning. That is my prayer. That is my hope. Christopher sat in that hidden chamber reading words written by a man who'd had everything and understood it meant nothing. He thought about his own life. Failed marriage, failed career, failing at basic provision for his children. But right now, in this moment, hunting through history for something that might not exist, he felt more alive than he had in years. The third fragment required them to solve what Rachel called the mirror room. On the mansion's third floor, tucked behind what appeared to be a linen closet, they found a meditation room Richard had constructed. Mirrors lined the walls at strange angles, and at first Christopher thought they were merely decorative. But when they arrived at sunrise on the 10th day, sunlight through the eastern window reflected off the mirrors in sequence, illuminating symbols carved into the ceiling. The symbols were numbers, a combination. Brandon copied them down and found the locked box built into the floor, hidden beneath a Persian rug that had rotted through in places. The combination worked on the first try. Inside fragment 3 and a letter. Richard had written to his son James, dated 1926. My boy, you asked me yesterday what makes a life worthwhile. I told you I would think on it. Here is my answer. A life is worthwhile when it creates more opportunity than it consumes, when it leaves the world slightly better than it found it, when it remembers that wealth is merely a tool, and the measure of a man is not what he owns but what he builds for others. The letter had never been sent. James had died before Richard could give it to him. The fourth fragment was the hardest to find. Where earth meets sky led them in circles, until Brandon suggested the obvious, the rooftop observatory. Richard Montgomery had been an amateur astronomer. Margaret's research had mentioned it. The observatory dome was rusted, the telescope inside ancient, but still functional. It took them 3 days to decipher the puzzle. The telescope had to point at specific coordinates during a full moon. When moonlight passed through the lens at exactly the right angle, it projected a pattern onto the far wall, a pattern that revealed a hidden safe. The combination was Catherine Montgomery's birth date. Inside the safe, the fourth fragment and the most important journal labeled Final Instructions. The 4 fragments fit together perfectly, forming a square key with a compass rose engraved in the center. The compass rose had a needle that spun freely, and when Christopher held it near certain walls, the needle would point, and the key would vibrate slightly. The journal explained Richard had embedded iron behind certain walls, creating magnetic fields. The key would guide them to the first vault. It pointed strongest toward the library floor. On the 13th day, Christopher called everyone, Catherine, Kenneth, Donald, Michelle, Margaret, and Thomas Reed, who'd finally agreed to help. They gathered in the library as Christopher inserted the key into a slot hidden in the floor medallion. The mechanism that activated was Victorian engineering genius. The floor section descended like an elevator, revealing stone steps leading down to a sub-basement Christopher hadn't known existed. At the bottom, a steel door with a combination lock and a riddle engraved above it, "I am not what I seem. Paper that grows, metal that sleeps, promises that compound. What am I?" Brandon solved it immediately. Financial instruments, stocks and bonds. The combination has to be major stock market dates. He tried the dates of the 1907 panic and the 1925 peak. The lock opened. Inside the vault, filing cabinets lined the walls. Glass display cases held stock certificates, AT&T, General Electric, Coca-Cola companies that had survived the Depression and grown into giants. Conservative estimate, Kenneth said, 60 to 80 million current value. But more important than the treasure was what else the vault contained: a map showing the locations of 4 more vaults, each progressively harder to find, and a letter from Richard that began, "Congratulations. You have proven yourself intelligent and persistent. But intelligence is not enough. The final trial requires not cleverness, but character. Consider carefully what you will do with what you have found." They were photographing everything when footsteps echoed in the stone passage. Christopher turned, heart hammering, and Ryan Clark emerged from the shadows. The developer looked at the open vault, at the stock certificates in their cases, at the family gathered around their discovery. His expression cycled through surprise, calculation, and something that might have been respect. "I've had a key to this house for 5 years. Harold gave it to me. I've searched every room, every closet, every crawl space. 5 years, Mr. Anderson." "How did you find this in 13 days?" Christopher said nothing. Ryan stepped closer, examining the vault's contents with practiced eyes. "Impressive. Truly. I'm going to make you a new offer. $600,000 cash for your claim to this property and everything in it. You have 48 hours to decide." After Ryan left, Brandon checked the security camera he'd installed secretly on day 3. The footage showed Ryan entering the house multiple times over the past 2 weeks, always at night, always careful not to disturb anything. He'd been watching them, learning from their success, waiting for them to solve the puzzle he couldn't crack. Christopher looked at his family, his children, his siblings, his father, even his ex-wife, all gathered in this hidden chamber beneath a house that should have been demolished. He looked at the stock certificates worth more than any of them would earn in their lifetimes. He looked at Richard Montgomery's letter and thought about a man who'd had everything and lost what mattered and tried to leave something meaningful behind. Rachel touched his arm, her voice small but certain. "We're going to keep looking right. There are 4 more vaults." Outside, night had fallen over Riverside. The mansion waited in darkness, keeping its secrets, demanding its proof. Christopher thought about Ryan Clark's offer, about the demolition deadline ticking down, about the impossibility of what they were attempting. But he thought, too, about his grandfather, the librarian, about 500 people at a funeral, about building things that last. "Yeah," he said. "We keep looking." Margaret called at 7 the next morning, her voice urgent enough that Christopher answered before his coffee finished brewing. "I found something. You need to come to the library, now." The genealogy chart covered an entire table when they arrived, branches and connections traced in Margaret's meticulous handwriting across 3 generations of photocopied records. She'd worked through the night, cross-referencing birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds. Ryan Clark's great-great-grandmother was Eleanor Montgomery Cross, Richard's younger sister. Brandon leaned over the chart, following the lines. "So he's family. He has a legitimate claim." Margaret pulled out another document, a will dated 1925, brittle with age but legally notarized. Richard's will states that if he died without direct heirs, his estate would pass to Eleanor's line. But there's a crucial clause, only if they prove worthy by completing the challenge. Those are Richard's exact words. Capitalized. Deliberate. Christopher felt the implications settling like snow. Ryan isn't just some developer. He's the legal heir if he can prove he deserves it. Which he couldn't do in 5 years of trying. But now you've opened the first vault. He knows the treasure exists. He knows where it is. And he has bloodline rights that you don't. Rachel had been quiet, studying the family tree. Her finger traced from Richard Montgomery down through Eleanor, through marriages and births, landing on Ryan Clark. "But we solved the puzzles. We found the vaults. Doesn't that count for something?" Margaret gathered the documents into a folder. "That's what a court will have to decide. And Christopher, you need to understand this isn't about who deserves the treasure morally, it's about who owns it legally. Those are very different questions." The emergency family meeting happened that afternoon in Catherine's real estate office, a space designed to make clients feel simultaneously impressed and slightly inadequate. Christopher arrived with both children and the folder Margaret had compiled. Kenneth brought his insurance assessments. Donald came alone, walking slower than he had the week before, looking older. Michelle appeared last, carrying a laptop and a legal pad covered in notes. "I've been researching all night. Trust law, inheritance precedents, abandoned property statutes." Catherine gestured them to the conference table, her earlier skepticism replaced by something harder and more focused. "Before we start, I need to say something. I was wrong. I thought this was Christopher being impractical again. I didn't see what you were actually doing." She pulled out her own folder, significantly thicker than Margaret's. "I've spent the last 2 days learning everything I can about property law as it applies to hidden assets. If we're doing this, we do it right. I can help with the legal framework, the property rights issues, the ownership structures. Kenneth adjusted his glasses, a gesture Christopher recognized as his brother preparing to deliver bad news. I contacted a friend, Stephen Taylor. He's one of the best estate lawyers in Connecticut. He agreed to meet with us tomorrow, but Christopher, you need to understand the costs. A legal battle over this kind of money could run $80,000 to $150,000, minimum. If it goes to full trial, double that. Christopher felt the numbers like physical weight. He had Donald's $5,000. He had maybe $2,000 in checking. Everything else was debt. Donald spoke quietly, but everyone stopped to listen. I've been thinking about your grandfather. When he wanted to start that library, everyone said it was impossible. Small town, no funding, depression just ending. He mortgaged his house, used his savings, worked 2 jobs for 5 years to keep it running. When he died, the library was serving 3 counties. He looked around the table. Sometimes the impossible things are just the ones nobody else had courage to try. If Christopher's doing this, I'm in, whatever it costs. Michelle opened her laptop, turning it so everyone could see. I found a precedent case. California, 1987. Miller versus State. A man inherited property, found gold hidden in the walls. The original owner's will had created a separate trust for the gold with specific instructions that it went to whoever followed the map and proved their worth. The court ruled that the treasure belonged to the finder who followed the instructions, not to the property owner or the bloodline heirs. Catherine leaned forward. That's exactly our situation. If we can prove Richard created a separate trust with specific criteria for inheritance, Christopher has a claim regardless of bloodline. But we don't have the trust documents, Kenneth pointed out. Michelle smiled, the expression small but significant. Not yet. But according to Richard's journal, he mentioned working with a law firm called Blackwood and Associates in Hartford. I found them. They're still operating as Blackwood Partners, LLP. I called this morning. They confirmed they have sealed documents related to Richard Montgomery dated October 1929. The instructions are to release them only to someone who presents proof of vault access. The room went silent. Outside the windows, Riverside's main street carried on with ordinary business people buying coffee, walking dogs, living lives uncomplicated by 90-year-old puzzles and multi-million-dollar stakes. Brandon broke the silence. So we need to find more vaults, get more proof, before Ryan figures out what we're doing. Christopher's phone buzzed. Text from Ryan Clark: offer stands for 36 more hours. After that, I'll need to pursue other options. Think about your children's future. The meeting with Stephen Taylor happened in an office that smelled like old books and new money. The lawyer was 55, with the kind of calm that came from having seen every variation of human greed and desperation. He listened to their story without interrupting, taking notes in shorthand. Christopher couldn't read. When they finished, Stephen steepled his fingers and delivered his assessment with the precision of a surgeon explaining a difficult operation. Legally, you're in complex territory. Christopher owns the house through Harold's will. That's clear. Ryan has a potential claim to any treasure found within that house through Richard's 1925 will. Also clear. The question is whether Richard created separate succession rules for the treasure that supersedes standard inheritance law. He pulled up documents on his computer. The Miller case Michelle found is relevant but not definitive. California law differs from Connecticut law in several key areas. We'd need to prove 3 things. First, that Richard intended the treasure to be inherited separately from the estate. Second, that he created valid legal mechanisms for that separate inheritance. Third, that Christopher has fulfilled whatever conditions Richard established. Kenneth shifted in his chair. What are our chances? If we find the full trust documents and they support our theory, 70%. If we don't find them and have to rely on journal entries and circumstantial evidence, 30%. Maybe less if Ryan has good attorneys. And he will. Stephen leaned back, the leather chair creaking. There's another issue. The moment Ryan files suit, and he will, the court will likely freeze the assets. You won't be able to access the vaults or remove anything. If you want to find the remaining treasures, you need to do it before he initiates legal proceedings. Christopher felt time compressing, the impossible timeline getting more impossible. How long do we have? If I were Ryan's attorney, I'd file within the week. Establish legal claim before you find more evidence that supports your position. Speed is his advantage, thoroughness is yours. They left Stephen's office with a retainer agreement that would cost $15,000 upfront money Christopher didn't have. Kenneth wrote the check without being asked. Consider it an investment. We're family. We solve this together. The lawsuit arrived on day 21, delivered by a process server who found Christopher measuring walls in the estate's ballroom. The complaint ran 37 pages, filed by Amanda Pierce of Pierce & Associates, one of the most expensive law firms in New York. The allegations were precise and devastating. Ryan Clark, as legitimate heir through Eleanor Montgomery Cross, claimed ownership of all assets discovered or to be discovered within Montgomery estate. Christopher Anderson had entered vaults without legal authority. The treasure constituted part of Richard Montgomery's estate and fell under the 1925 will's provisions. Request for immediate temporary restraining order preventing removal of any items pending resolution. Stephen called an hour later. They moved faster than I expected. Emergency hearing tomorrow at 10. Judge will decide on the restraining order. Bring everything: journals, photographs, the fragments. We need to show you had legitimate reason to believe you were following Richard's instructions. The courtroom was smaller than Christopher expected, wood-paneled and fluorescent-lit justice delivered in the same institutional spaces as parking violations and small claims. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, 62, and rumored to have no patience for wealthy people's inheritance disputes. Amanda Pierce presented Ryan's case with the efficiency of someone billing $800 per hour. Genealogy charts, the 1925 will, photographs of vault contents, expert testimony about the stock certificate's value, conservative estimate now revised upward to $85 million for Vault 1 alone. Your Honor, Mr. Clark is the rightful heir through established bloodline. Mr. Anderson may own the building, but the treasure belongs to the original estate. We request immediate asset freeze and eviction from the property until ownership is determined. Stephen countered with Richard's journals, the puzzle solutions, the evidence of separate succession planning. Your Honor, Richard Montgomery explicitly created a challenge separate from his estate. The journals make clear this was intentional. Mr. Anderson has followed those instructions precisely. Freezing the vaults now would be like stopping a test halfway through and declaring the person who showed up late the winner. Judge Morrison read through documents while both sides waited. Finally, she looked up. I'm granting a modified restraining order. Vault 1 is sealed pending resolution. However, Mr. Anderson may continue to inhabit the property and search for additional evidence. Any further discoveries must be photographed and documented but may not be removed. Both parties will return in 3 weeks for preliminary hearing on the underlying ownership question. Outside the courthouse, Amanda Pierce approached with Ryan Clark trailing behind. Mr. Anderson, my client is prepared to increase his settlement offer, $800,000. You keep the house, he gets vault contents. Clean split, no litigation. Christopher looked at Ryan, trying to read the man behind the developer's polish. Why not just wait for the court to give you everything? Ryan's smile didn't reach his eyes. Because litigation is expensive and uncertain. This way we both get something. The alternative is years of legal bills and possible loss for both of us. After they left, Stephen pulled Christopher aside. That's a serious offer. $800,000 would change your life, and there's no guarantee we win at trial. Christopher watched his children talking with Margaret by her car, animated and energized despite the setback. Rachel was showing her sketches from the estate's conservatory patterns. She'd noticed that might be clues. Brandon was explaining his theory about the astronomical symbols in the meditation room. We keep looking. We find the other vaults. We prove Richard wanted someone like us to find this. The search intensified with desperation sharpening focus. They had 3 weeks before the preliminary hearing, 3 weeks to find evidence strong enough to overcome bloodline claims and expensive attorneys. Vault 2 revealed itself through Rachel's insight about gardens and stone. She'd been reading Richard's letters to his wife, found references to the garden where we'll rest together. The estate had a mausoleum Christopher had dismissed as decorative decay. But when they cleared the overgrowth, they found it was actually a sundial with specific positions marked. The positions corresponded to family birthdays. Set the sundial correctly. Richard's birth, Catherine's birth, James and Eleanor's births in sequence, and the underground chamber opened with a pneumatic hiss that suggested the mechanism had been waiting 90 years for exactly this combination. Inside, rare coins from civilizations that had risen and fallen. Roman aureus, Byzantine solidus, Greek drachma. The kind of collection that took decades to assemble and would sell for $35 million at the right auction. Personal items, too. Richard's pocket watch, Catherine's jewelry, photographs of children who'd died too young. The letter to Eleanor, Richard's daughter, dated 1922. My dearest girl, you asked me what happens after we die. I told you I would think on it. Here is what I believe we continue in what we leave behind, in memories held by those who loved us, in work that outlasts our brief time, in the difference we made, however small, in making the world slightly less cruel. The letter had been written a year before Eleanor died of influenza at age 8. Christopher sat in that underground chamber reading a father's words to a daughter who never got to grow up, and thought about his own children searching through dust and history upstairs. What was he leaving them beyond debt and uncertainty? What would they remember about this time when the impossible thing either became possible or crushed them? Vault 3 required solving what Brandon called the greenhouse puzzle. Behind a false wall in the ballroom, they found a conservatory that shouldn't exist, a glass-roofed room full of plants that had somehow survived decades without care. Succulents adapted to neglect, air plants drawing moisture from Connecticut humidity, a few stubborn ferns. The plants weren't random. Arranged correctly according to constellation patterns from the meditation room ceiling, they triggered a photosensitive mechanism. Margaret helped identify the species, each one corresponding to a star in Orion's belt, Cassiopeia Ursa Major. When they arranged them in proper stellar formation, sunlight through the glass roof at precisely noon activated cells that Richard had engineered using principles that wouldn't become commonplace for another 50 years. The vault held real estate deeds to properties Richard had acquired during the 1920s, boom, and sold before the crash. Manhattan buildings now worth $20 million each. Chicago parcels that had appreciated 1,000-fold. Boston warehouses converted to luxury condos. Total current value $95 million according to Kenneth's careful research. More important were the patents, railroad safety devices Richard had invented, contracts with companies that still paid royalties, business agreements with corporations that had grown into Fortune 500 giants. The journal entry from 1929, wealth compounds, not through hoarding, but through circulation. Every dollar invested wisely creates opportunities that generate more opportunities. The question is never, how much can I keep, but rather, how much can I create? Those who understand this difference will inherit not just my fortune, but the wisdom to use it well. They documented everything meticulously as Judge Morrison had ordered. Photographs from every angle, video walkthroughs, detailed inventories. Margaret authenticated documents. Thomas Reed, the retired banker who'd finally agreed to help, verified the financial instrument's validity. But the clock kept ticking. Day 28, Day 30, Day 33. Vault 4 proved the most difficult. Where Earth meets sky led them back to the rooftop observatory, but this time the challenge was different. The telescope had to point at Polaris at exactly midnight on the anniversary of Catherine's death. The date was December 3rd. They'd found the clue on November 28th, which meant 5 days of waiting while lawyers filed motions and counter-motions, and the preliminary hearing approached. The night finally came, cold and clear, winter arriving early to Connecticut. The entire family gathered on the roof, Christopher and his children, Catherine and Kenneth Donald, moving slowly up the stairs, Michelle with her careful documentation, Margaret and Thomas witnessing for authenticity. Brandon had calculated the angles precisely. Rachel had restored the telescope's focusing mechanism. When Polaris's light passed through the lens at exactly 12:03 a.m., it projected a pattern onto the far wall that resolved into numbers. Catherine's birth date, the combination to a safe built into the observatory floor. Inside the safe stock certificates that made Kenneth audibly gasp. IBM before computers were household items, Boeing before commercial aviation dominated travel, Disney before anyone imagined what the company would become. Companies Richard had recognized would survive not just depression, but would define the century to follow. Value $180 million conservatively. The trust documents were there too, but incomplete. Pages labeled, "The Montgomery Legacy Trust established October 15, 1929. The trustee designation read clearly, "Whosoever completes the 5 trials and proves worthy through deed, not blood." But the signature pages were missing. The final instructions were absent. A note paper clipped to the front. Complete documents sealed with Blackwood and Associates, Hartford. Release upon completion of 5th trial. Stephen examined the partial trust documents with the kind of intensity that made Christopher's stomach tighten. "This is strong evidence, but it's not complete. We need the full documents from Blackwood, which means we need to complete this 5th trial." Margaret had been quiet, studying Richard's final journal entry from the observatory vault. When she looked up, her expression carried something between revelation and warning. The 5th trial isn't another puzzle. Listen to what Richard wrote. "I have tested intelligence through complexity. I have tested persistence through difficulty. I have tested observation through hidden details. Now I test character through choice. The final trial has no answer key, no mechanism to unlock. It requires only that the finder prove their worthiness through demonstrating how they will use what they have found." The words settled over them like snow. Brandon voiced what everyone was thinking. "So we can't find Vault 5. We have to earn it." The search for a 5th vault consumed the next 4 days. They examined every room again, checked blueprints against actual construction, measured walls for hidden spaces. Nothing. The estate's architectural plans showed 4 vaults, not 5. Richard's journals mentioned 5 trials, but only 4 physical locations. Christopher sat in the main hall at 3 in the morning on day 39, exhausted and running out of time. The preliminary hearing was in 3 days. They had evidence of 4 vaults worth $360 million combined. They had partial trust documents suggesting Richard intended separate succession, but they didn't have the final proof that would tip the scales. Rachel found him there at dawn, wrapped in a blanket against the November cold that seeped through walls. "You're looking for another room." Christopher nodded. "What if it's not a room? What if it's something else?" She pulled out her master sketchbook, the one where she'd been compiling all the patterns, all the clues, all the connections. Every trial tested something: intelligence, persistence, observation, wisdom. But the 5th trial is different. It tests what you'll do with what you found. Maybe the vault opens when you show you deserve it. Christopher looked at his daughter, 11 years old, standing in a freezing mansion at dawn, wearing pajamas and determination in equal measure. "How do we show that?" Rachel pulled out the proposal they'd been working on, the document they'd started as an intellectual exercise and slowly refined into something real. The plan for what to do with the fortune if they won. Scholarships, community programs, historical preservation. Everything they'd discussed in family meetings, everything Catherine had researched, everything Kenneth had calculated, everything Michelle had legally structured. "We show him this. We show Richard what we're going to build." The proposal took 2 more days to complete. 65 pages of detailed planning, financial projections, impact assessments, legal frameworks. Every member of the family contributed their expertise. Catherine developed the real estate conversion plan, transforming the estate into a museum and education center, calculating costs and timelines. Kenneth created endowment models showing how the fortune could generate sustainable funding for generations. Michelle drafted the legal structure for a foundation that would outlive them all. Donald wrote the Veterans Support Program, drawing on 50 years of watching friends struggle after service. Margaret designed the historical archive, digitizing local history before it disappeared. Thomas contributed banking expertise, ensuring the financial mechanisms would function properly. Rachel sketched the visual identity, logos, building plans, scholarship program materials. Brandon built financial models projecting impact over decades. Christopher tied it together, writing the mission statement that attempted to capture what Richard Montgomery had been reaching for across 90 years of silence. The night before the preliminary hearing, Christopher emailed the complete proposal to Blackwood Partners with a simple message: "I have completed 4 trials. For the 5th trial, I submit this as proof of worthy intent." The automated response came 2 hours later. Received. Proposal under review per instructions left by Richard Montgomery, 1929. Decision will be rendered at time of legal proceeding. Sleep proved impossible. Christopher walked through the estate one final time, room by room, thinking about everything they'd found and everything they stood to lose. The demolition order had been temporarily stayed pending legal resolution, but if Ryan won, the estate would be torn down within months. The fortune would be liquidated, distributed according to bloodline rather than vision. At 4 a.m., Ryan Clark called. "I know about the other vaults. I know you found trust documents. I'm prepared to make a final offer. $25 million. You keep the house and walk away wealthy. I get the vault contents and move on with my development plans. Win-win." $25 million. Enough to execute 60% of their proposal. Enough to change everything without risking everything. Christopher watched the sun rise over Riverside through 19th-century windows, light touching the same walls it had touched when Richard Montgomery walked these halls. "No, we go to court." Ryan's voice hardened. "You're making a mistake. My attorney is one of the best in the country. Your lawyer is good, but this isn't about who's better. It's about who has the stronger legal position. I have bloodline. I have the 1925 will. You have journals and partial trust documents. A judge will side with established law over romantic treasure hunts." Maybe, but Richard didn't create this puzzle for his family. He created it for someone willing to do what he couldn't. And what's that? Use wealth to create opportunity instead of just passing it down. We're going to prove we're that someone. After hanging up, Christopher found his entire family gathered in the kitchen. Catherine making coffee, Kenneth reviewing documents, Donald reading the newspaper, Michelle typing on her laptop, Rachel sketching Brandon running calculations. They'd all come early, unable to sleep either. Catherine poured coffee into mismatched mugs from the estate's remaining kitchen supplies. "Ryan called you. How did you know?" "Because if I were him, that's when I'd make the final push. Dawn of battle, last chance to avoid bloodshed. What did he offer?" $25 million. Kenneth whistled low. "That's real money. That's life-changing money." Christopher sat at the table where 3 generations of Montgomerys had probably eaten breakfast, where Richard had read morning papers and planned his puzzles and tried to figure out how to leave something meaningful behind. It's also giving up. It's saying we trust money more than meaning. Donald folded his newspaper with careful precision. "Your grandfather once told me something I didn't understand until too late. He said the hardest thing about building something worthwhile is that you never know if it'll work until after you're too committed to quit. But that uncertainty is exactly what makes it worthwhile. Easy things don't change the world." Michelle closed her laptop. "The kids are watching. Whatever we teach them today, they'll carry forever. Do we teach them to take the safe money and comfortable life? Or do we teach them that some things are worth fighting for even when the odds aren't good?" Rachel looked up from her sketch, a drawing of the estate transformed people walking through gardens, children playing on lawns, light streaming through restored windows. "We fight." Brandon nodded. "We fight." They arrived at the courthouse at 9:30, 30 minutes before the preliminary hearing. Stephen Taylor met them on the steps, briefcase in hand, expression carefully neutral. Blackwood Partners sent a representative, Jonathan Blackwood, the 3rd senior partner. He's inside with a sealed envelope. He told the clerk it's evidence relevant to the case. Christopher felt his pulse hammering. "Did he say what kind of evidence?" "No, but he's been waiting since 8 a.m. Whatever's in that envelope, he wanted to be here when it opened." They filed into the courtroom, Christopher and his family on one side, Ryan Clark with Amanda Pierce and her associates on the other. The gallery was packed with reporters who'd caught wind of the story, local residents curious about the mansion mystery treasure hunters who followed such things religiously. Judge Morrison entered at precisely 10 o'clock. "We're here for preliminary hearing in the matter of Clark versus Anderson regarding ownership of assets discovered at Montgomery Estate. Before we begin, I understand there's new evidence." Jonathan Blackwood stood a man in his late 70s carrying the weight of institutional authority and 95 years of professional obligation. "Your Honor, my firm has held sealed documents for Richard Montgomery since October 1929. Our instructions were specific: release them only when someone presents proof of completing what Mr. Montgomery called the fifth trial. Last night we received such proof." He approached the bench with an envelope wax seal intact. "This has not been opened since 1929. The conditions for opening have now been met." Judge Morrison broke the seal herself, the wax cracking with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the silent courtroom. Inside the envelope, documents thick enough to constitute a small book, a letter on Montgomery family letterhead, and something that made the judge's eyebrows rise, a metal canister labeled in faded ink. Jonathan Blackwood cleared his throat. 95 years of professional discretion finally released. "Your Honor, the canister contains what Richard Montgomery called his video testimony, recorded using a Kinemacolor camera in October 1929. The technology was experimental at the time. We've had it digitized for modern playback." Amanda Pierce stood immediately, objection crystallizing. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We've had no opportunity to examine this evidence, no chance to verify authenticity. This could be anything." Judge Morrison examined the canister, then the accompanying documents. "Mr. Blackwood, your firm's reputation spans a century. Do you personally vouch for the authenticity of these materials?" "I do, Your Honor. They've been in our vault since my grandfather accepted them. The seal was unbroken until today. Everything has been preserved exactly as Richard Montgomery intended." The judge gestured to the bailiff. "Set up playback. Both counsels will have opportunity to examine everything, but given that we're already assembled, we'll view this now." The video quality was remarkable for 1929 color, though muted, and sound that crackled but remained comprehensible. Richard Montgomery appeared on the screen seated in what Christopher recognized as the estate's library. Mid-50s, gray at the temples, eyes carrying the kind of exhaustion that comes from losing what cannot be replaced. Richard's voice filled the courtroom, speaking across decades. "My name is Richard Montgomery. Today is October 20th, 1929. I am of sound mind and body, as will be attested by 3 witnesses whose signatures appear on accompanying documents. I make this recording because I believe the written word, no matter how carefully crafted, cannot convey intent as clearly as spoken truth." He paused, gathering something that looked like courage. "I have spent 30 years accumulating wealth. I believed, as young men do, that money would solve problems, create happiness, secure futures. Then I lost my son to an accident that wealth could not prevent. I lost my daughter to an illness that money could not cure. Now I am losing my wife to a condition that all my fortune cannot reverse. We leave next week for Switzerland, seeking treatment I know will fail, but must attempt anyway." Christopher felt Rachel's hand find his, her fingers cold. Richard continued, his voice steady despite whatever grief lay beneath. "I have converted my assets according to analysis that suggests economic catastrophe approaches. The signs are unmistakable to anyone willing to see. When the collapse comes, wealth will vanish like morning fog. I have protected mine not for myself. I have failed in every way that matters, but for whoever proves worthy of the responsibility I could not properly bear." He leaned forward, speaking directly to the camera, directly across time. "I do not want my wealth to pass automatically to blood relatives. My sister Eleanor and her children are well provided for through our parents' estate. They do not need mine, and automatic inheritance teaches nothing except expectation. I want my fortune to find someone who needs opportunity and will use it to create opportunity for others, someone who values wisdom over wealth, someone who understands that the measure of a life is not what you keep, but what you build, that continues after you're gone. The camera angle shifted, showing the three witnesses' attorneys from Blackwood's firm, dated identification visible. Richard picked up a document, holding it to the camera. I have created the Montgomery Legacy Trust separate from my general estate. The trust contains the bulk of my converted assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, precious items. Total current value approximately $15 million. I estimate that fortune properly managed will grow to exceed $200 million within a century. Kenneth inhaled sharply. Richard's projection had been conservative. The actual value was $360 million and counting. The trust has one beneficiary whoever completes 5 trials I have designed. The trials test intelligence, persistence, observation, wisdom, and character. The first 4 can be solved through cleverness. The 5th requires something deeper. It requires the candidate to demonstrate through detailed proposal how they will use the fortune to benefit others across generations. Richard set down the document, his expression softening into something that might have been hope. If you are watching this, you have completed the trials. You have proven yourself intelligent enough to solve complex puzzles, persistent enough to continue when others would have quit, observant enough to see what others miss, wise enough to understand that wealth is responsibility. Now you must prove your character by showing how you will use what I have hidden. He stood moving to the window, speaking with his back to the camera. I failed as a husband. I failed as a father. I failed to understand what mattered until everything that mattered was lost. But perhaps failure can teach what success cannot. Perhaps my wealth earned through ambition that blinded me to what I should have treasured can find someone who will use it with the wisdom I lacked. Richard turned back, facing the camera directly. The trust documents make you sole trustee with complete authority. You can dissolve the trust any time and keep the money. I cannot force you to honor my wishes. I can only trust that if you came this far, you are someone who chooses service over selfishness. Prove me right. Make my wealth matter. Make it build something that lasts. The screen went dark. The courtroom remained silent for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Judge Morrison broke the spell by opening the trust indenture, reading through pages of legal language while both attorneys waited. Finally, she looked up. This appears to be a validly executed trust document, notarized, witnessed, meeting all Connecticut requirements as they existed in 1929. Mr. Blackwood, you've verified the signatures. We have, Your Honor. All 3 witnesses were Blackwood attorneys. All signatures have been authenticated through historical records. The trust was never registered because Mr. Montgomery designed it to remain dormant until activated by completion of his trials. Amanda Pierce had recovered her composure, already formulating counter-arguments. Your Honor, emotional testimony aside, this doesn't change the fundamental legal question. Connecticut inheritance law. Judge Morrison raised a hand. I'm going to hear arguments now. Ms. Pierce, you may proceed. Amanda stood, commanding the courtroom with practiced authority. Your Honor, we sympathize with Richard Montgomery's tragic losses and admire his philanthropic intentions. But intentions do not override law. My client, Ryan Clark, is Richard Montgomery's great-great-grandnephew through Eleanor Montgomery Cross. The 1925 will clearly states that in the absence of direct heirs, the estate passes to Eleanor's line. That's established inheritance law. She pulled up exhibits on her tablet, projecting them onto the courtroom screen. Richard Montgomery died in 1931 in Geneva. His estate entered probate. The house and grounds were sold to settle debts. But the hidden treasure was never found, never probated, never legally transferred. It remained part of the original estate, which by law should have passed to Eleanor's descendants. Catherine leaned forward, whispering to Christopher, "She's good. That's a strong argument." Amanda continued, building momentum. The puzzle and the trials are interesting historical curiosities, but they have no legal standing. You cannot create binding inheritance conditions through treasure hunts. The trust document, even if valid when created, was never properly executed because the assets were never properly transferred into it. They remained in Richard's estate. My client is the rightful heir to that estate. She paused for effect, making eye contact with the judge. Mr. Anderson completed puzzles. That's admirable. But admiration is not ownership. We request that the court recognize my client's legitimate bloodline claim and award him full ownership of all discovered and yet to be discovered assets, with compensation to Mr. Anderson for his time and effort in locating them." Stephen Taylor rose, carrying the calm that came from 3 decades of courtroom battles. "Your Honor, Ms. Pierce makes it sound simple, but inheritance law has always recognized the right of property owners to set conditions on succession. The precedent is vast and well established." He cited cases rapidly: Shapira versus Union National Bank, where a father's requirement that his son marry within the Jewish faith was upheld; Estate of Feinberg, where conditional inheritance based on educational achievement was validated; Miller versus State, where treasure hunt instructions superseded standard probate. Richard Montgomery had every right to create separate succession rules for his fortune. The trust document is valid. The video testimony confirms his intent. The conditions are legal and not against public policy. In fact, they serve public policy by encouraging responsible wealth stewardship. Stephen pulled up his own exhibits. Christopher's proposal, the 65 pages of detailed planning. Mr. Anderson has fulfilled every condition Richard established. He gained lawful property access through his uncle's will. He solved all puzzles through intelligence and persistence. He demonstrated worthy intent through this comprehensive plan for using the fortune to benefit Connecticut communities for generations. These aren't just pleasant ideas. These are detailed, financially sound programs with real impact projections. He turned to face Ryan directly. Mr. Clark had 5 years of property access through his arrangement with Harold Anderson. 5 years to solve the puzzles Richard created. He found nothing. Mr. Anderson succeeded in 42 days. That difference is precisely what Richard Montgomery was testing. Not bloodline, not privilege, but dedication, insight, and genuine commitment to building something meaningful. Amanda objected, voice sharp. "Your Honor, we're not here to judge who's more dedicated or more moral. We're here to determine legal ownership." Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "And that's what I'm going to do. But Ms. Pierce, you can't ask me to ignore clear evidence of testamentary intent. Richard Montgomery created elaborate mechanisms specifically to avoid automatic bloodline inheritance. The question is whether those mechanisms have legal force." She reviewed documents for another 10 minutes while the courtroom waited in suspended tension. Christopher watched her read, trying to decipher meaning from the small movements of her eyes. The occasional nod. The twice she paused to reread passages. Finally, Judge Morrison set down the papers and removed her glasses. "I've reviewed all evidence, precedents, and applicable law. This is my ruling. The Montgomery Legacy Trust is valid. Properly executed under 1929, Connecticut law, properly maintained in sealed custody, properly activated by completion of specified conditions." The video testimony confirms Richard Montgomery's intent beyond reasonable doubt. He wanted his wealth to go to someone who proved worthy through action, not someone who inherited worthiness through blood. Ryan's face went pale. Amanda Pierce's jaw tightened, but she maintained professional composure. The judge continued. "The trust conditions are legal. Requiring completion of puzzles is unusual but not unprecedented. Requiring demonstration of worthy intent through detailed planning is, if anything, admirable public policy. Mr. Anderson has fulfilled all conditions. The 65-page proposal submitted to Blackwood Partners demonstrates exactly the kind of thoughtful stewardship Richard Montgomery sought." She looked directly at Christopher. "Mr. Anderson, you are hereby recognized as sole trustee of the Montgomery Legacy Trust, with full authority to manage and distribute assets according to trust terms. All vault contents discovered or to be discovered are trust property under your stewardship." The gavel came down. "Mr. Clark's claims are dismissed. Restraining order on Vault 1 is lifted. Both parties are reminded that trustee authority comes with fiduciary responsibility. This court will monitor compliance with trust terms." The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations. Rachel grabbed Christopher's arm, tears streaming. Brandon sat stunned, processing. Catherine covered her mouth. Kenneth removed his glasses to wipe them. Donald closed his eyes, lips moving in what might have been prayer. Michelle leaned over, voice barely audible. "You did it. You actually did it." Outside the courthouse, media swarmed like starlings, microphones thrust forward questions overlapping into incomprehensibility. Stephen shepherded them through the crowd to a coffee shop 3 blocks away where they could breathe. The reality settled slowly like snow accumulating. $360 million. Responsibility for wealth that could change thousands of lives or be squandered in ego and poor planning. The trust terms gave Christopher authority, but also obligation. He couldn't just keep the money. Richard's instructions were clear. The fortune existed to create opportunity, and courts would be watching to ensure compliance. Rachel pulled out her sketchbook, already refining designs for the museum conversion, the scholarship program logo, the foundation's visual identity. Brandon opened his laptop, updating financial models with actual vault values instead of estimates. The work was just beginning. Ryan Clark found them an hour later, entering the coffee shop alone. No Amanda Pierce. No associates. Just a man in an expensive suit looking smaller than he had that morning. Christopher tensed, but Ryan raised both hands. "I'm not here to fight. I wanted to apologize for how I approached this." He pulled out a chair, sitting without invitation. "My family has told stories about Richard Montgomery's treasure since I was 5 years old. My grandfather spent his savings searching for it. My father did the same. Both died believing the family had been cheated out of our inheritance. I thought if I found it, I could prove they'd been right all along. Prove we were worthy." His voice carried genuine emotion for the first time since Christopher had met him. "But today I realized they were wrong. We weren't cheated. We were given opportunity to prove ourselves. We failed. You succeeded. That's not injustice. That's exactly what Richard intended." Christopher studied the man across the table, developer-opponent, someone who'd threatened and pressured and offered increasingly large bribes to avoid this exact outcome. "The foundation will have a board of directors. We'll need people with business experience, real estate knowledge, financial expertise. If you're interested in serving the community instead of profiting from it, there's a place for you." Ryan's surprise showed clearly. "After everything I did, you'd want me involved." Richard didn't create this puzzle to punish people. He created it to find people who'd use wealth responsibly. Maybe you can learn to be that person. Maybe serving is how you prove yourself worthy after all. Ryan stood, extending his hand. "I need time. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not chasing my family's ghost. But ask me again in a year. If I've done something to deserve it, I'll say yes." He pulled out his checkbook, writing quickly. "For now, this is what I can do. $100,000 for your scholarship fund. First step." After he left, Donald spoke quietly. "That took courage. Both of you." The next revelation came that evening when they returned to the estate. Jonathan Blackwood had left another envelope, this one addressed simply, "To the trustee." Inside a key, a map, and a letter in Richard's handwriting. "If you have received this, the court has recognized your trusteeship. There remains one final vault, though not in the sense you might expect. The key opens a chamber in the main hall beneath the floor where you first entered. Inside, you will find not treasure, but truth, the full story of my life, my failures, my hopes. Take from it what you will. Use it to remember that wealth is merely a tool, and the person wielding it determines whether it builds or destroys." The chamber opened where they'd walked dozens of times, the floor medallion accepting Richard's key and lowering to reveal stairs Christopher had never suspected existed. At the bottom, a small circular room lined with bookshelves holding leather-bound journals spanning Richard's entire life. In the center, a single display case containing items that made Christopher's throat tighten: Catherine's wedding ring, James's first school report, Eleanor's favorite doll. The precious things Richard had kept when he fled to Switzerland, the things he'd brought back when he returned to seal his fortune and create his trials. Photographs covered one wall, not the formal portraits in the house, but candid shots showing real life. Richard pushing James on a swing, Catherine reading to Eleanor, family dinners, birthday parties. The mundane moments that constituted a life before tragedy carved it hollow. The final journal lay open to the last entry, dated October 21, 1929. Tomorrow I seal the vaults and leave Riverside forever. Catherine grows weaker daily. The doctors in Geneva are our final hope, though I know hope is all they offer. I have prepared this house, these puzzles, this test. I do not know if anyone will ever find what I have hidden. I do not know if the person who finds it will use it as I hope, but I have done all I can. I have created opportunity for someone to be better than I was, to use wealth I accumulated while neglecting what mattered to build something that helps others not make my mistakes. If you are reading this, you are that someone. Do not waste your chance as I wasted mine. Every day matters. Every choice compounds. Build something worthy of the time you are given. Rachel read it twice, her voice barely managing the words. Brandon stood silent, processing. The adults gathered around, understanding in different ways what Richard had been trying to teach across 9 decades. This wasn't about treasure. It had never been about treasure. It was about whether wealth could be redeemed by being used to create what the person who earned it had failed to create, meaning that outlasted mortality. The public announcement happened 2 weeks later in the estate's restored main hall. Christopher stood before microphones and cameras, his family arrayed behind him, ready to explain what they intended to build. The Montgomery Legacy Foundation would convert the estate into a museum and education center, preserving the puzzles as interactive exhibits teaching problem-solving and historical thinking. The scholarship program would provide 100 full scholarships annually to Connecticut students who demonstrated need and promise. The Small Business Incubator would offer low-interest loans and mentorship to local entrepreneurs. Arts programs would serve underserved youth. Legal aid would help families who couldn't afford attorneys. Historical preservation would save buildings throughout the state. Veterans support would honor those who'd served. Total commitment, $420 million, the foundation's entire trust value after accounting for Vault 5's contents. Remaining $80 million would stay invested, growing to fund future needs and ensure the foundation lasted the 100 years Richard had envisioned and beyond. Catherine handled the real estate conversion, her expertise finally deployed toward something she could believe in. Kenneth managed the endowments, ensuring financial sustainability. Michelle, having returned to law school full-time, would lead the legal aid program after graduation. Donald oversaw veterans services with the passion of someone who'd waited 50 years to help comrades who'd never received the support they deserved. Margaret curated the historical archives, finally publishing her dissertation as a book that told the story of the Stewardship Circle and the 7 other wealthy industrialists who'd created similar puzzles to test their heirs. The book became a minor bestseller, inspiring 3 families to search for treasures their ancestors had hidden. Thomas Reed handled community liaison, his banking connections and local relationships smoothing the foundation's integration into Riverside's civic infrastructure. Rachel and Brandon took on roles unprecedented for their ages. Rachel chairing a youth advisory board that ensured programs actually served young people's needs. Brandon directing technology initiatives that would bring the foundation into the digital age. The work consumed them, but unlike the consuming weight of poverty and failure, this felt like purpose given form. 6 months transformed Riverside in ways both visible and subtle. The estate restoration reached 60% completion, skilled craftsmen repairing 90 years of decay while preserving historical integrity. The museum soft opened with 500 visitors, daily families exploring Richard's puzzles, students learning about the Gilded Age and the Depression, tourists drawn by the treasure hunt story that had captured national attention. The first scholarship ceremony brought 100 students to the estate's lawn recipients, selected through a process emphasizing potential over pedigree, need over privilege, character over credentials. Rachel stood at the podium 12, now having grown an inch, and gained the kind of confidence that came from being taken seriously by adults who had every reason to dismiss her. Her voice carried across the crowd without amplification. Mr. Montgomery believed the best inheritance wasn't money, but opportunity. He believed people proved themselves through what they chose to do when given the chance. Everyone here earned this opportunity. Now it's on us to prove him right by using it to create opportunities for others. Brandon sat in the front row, acceptance letter from MIT in his pocket. Richard Montgomery's scholar designation making possible what his family could never have afforded. He'd spend the next 4 years studying engineering and business, preparing to expand the foundation's reach beyond Connecticut. The business incubator funded its 23rd startup, a bakery owned by a veteran who'd been homeless 3 months prior. The bakery supplied pastries for the scholarship ceremony, creating a circle that felt like the kind of compounding opportunity Richard's journal had described. Christopher quit substitute teaching with a goodbye that felt simultaneously like loss and liberation. The foundation paid him $120,000 annually as trustee, modest by CEO standards, but fortune by his previous life's measure. He'd moved his family from the cramped apartment to a comfortable house near the estate, nothing extravagant, just space enough to breathe and plan. Michelle stopped by the estate weekly. Her relationship with Christopher transformed from the adversarial civility of divorce to something resembling partnership. They'd never reconcile romantically, too much water under too many bridges, but they co-parented with mutual respect and worked together effectively on foundation legal matters. "The kids are different," she observed one afternoon watching Rachel lead a tour for elementary students, Brandon explaining the astronomical puzzle to visiting engineers. Christopher nodded. "They're becoming who they were supposed to be. We just didn't have resources to let them." "No, we had the resources. We just didn't see them." She pulled out her laptop, showing him the latest legal aid statistics. 50 families served, 15 facing eviction, now housed 8 small claims cases won that would have been lost without representation. This is what Richard meant about wealth being a tool. It's not the dollars that matter. It's what the dollars enable people to do. The foundation's impact rippled outward in ways both measured and immeasurable. Catherine's real estate expertise, once deployed to help wealthy clients become wealthier, now saved historic buildings from demolition and converted abandoned properties into community spaces. Kenneth's actuarial precision, previously calculating insurance premiums, now projected how educational investments would compound across generations. Donald's military service, once a source of painful memories, became the foundation for programs that prevented other veterans from suffering alone. Each person had brought their expertise to bear on problems they'd previously ignored or felt powerless to address. Richard's fortune hadn't created their skills. It had simply given them the resources to use those skills for something beyond personal survival. The town of Riverside itself transformed subtly but measurably. Unemployment dropped 15%. 3 new businesses launched monthly. High school graduation rates climbed. The library. Christopher's grandfather's library received its first major donation in 30 years, expanding hours and services. National media attention brought tourism, that brought revenue, that brought civic improvements, that brought pride, that brought more engagement in a cycle that fed itself. The estate's dining room hosted the foundation's first board meeting 6 months and 1 day after the verdict. The full board had finally assembled: Christopher, Catherine, Kenneth, Michelle, Margaret Thomas, Donald, Rachel, Brandon, and Stephen Taylor, who'd agreed to serve as legal counsel and board member. Ryan Clark's chair remained empty, but reserved his name on the roster with notation, Year 1 deferral. Christopher opened the meeting with the ritual they'd established. Reading the mission statement Rachel had drafted based on Richard's own words, "The Montgomery Legacy Foundation exists to create opportunity that creates more opportunity. We measure success not in dollars managed, but in lives changed. We remember that wealth is merely a tool, and the person wielding it determines whether it builds or destroys. We commit to building." Reports followed: scholarship program exceeding expectations, business incubator generating jobs, museum attracting donors, legal aid expanding historical preservation, saving 5 buildings slated for demolition. Numbers that translated to human stories. Statistics that represented changed trajectories. During the community liaison report, Thomas mentioned a curious development. "I've been contacted by 3 families whose ancestors were part of what Margaret calls the stewardship circle. They want our help finding treasures their great-great-grandfathers hid. Similar puzzles, similar tests. Margaret's book created a roadmap. Margaret leaned forward, excited by the prospect. If we help them, we can document the process, create educational materials, show that Richard's approach wasn't unique, but part of a larger philosophy about responsible wealth transfer. The board voted unanimously to assist expanding the foundation's mission to include helping others discover not just material treasure, but the treasure of purposeful living. As the meeting adjourned, Christopher found himself standing in the same main hall where he'd first entered 44 weeks ago. The space had been transformed, walls, repaired floors, restored chandelier gleaming. But more than physical restoration, the hall had been returned to purpose. It welcomed people instead of repelling them. It taught instead of decaying. It lived instead of haunting. Rachel appeared beside him, sketchbook clutched as always. "Bah, if Uncle Harold hadn't left you this house, where do you think we'd be?" Christopher considered the question, imagining alternative histories where he'd never received that call from Gerald Whitmore's office, where the estate had been sold to Ryan Clark for $200,000, where he'd remained a substitute teacher struggling to pay electricity bills. Probably still in that apartment, still wondering how to afford your art supplies and Brandon's college applications, still feeling like I'd failed you both. You never failed us. You just hadn't found the right way to succeed yet. She opened her sketchbook to a new page showing him the design she'd been developing, a logo incorporating the compass rose from Richard's Key, the Montgomery family crest, and a seedling growing toward light. For the Foundation's new initiative, helping other families find their own treasures. Christopher studied the design, seeing in it something Richard would have appreciated: the past informing the future tragedy, transforming into teaching wealth, converting into wisdom. It's perfect. That evening, after everyone had left, Christopher walked through the estate one final time before locking up. He moved through rooms where Richard Montgomery had lived and loved and lost, where Catherine had read to children who died too young, where a family had built a life before that life shattered. He ended in the library, in the chair where he imagined Richard had sat writing his journals, planning his puzzles, hoping someone worthy would someday find what he'd hidden. The final letter from Vault 5 lay on the desk. Christopher having brought it up to read occasionally, when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. He read it again now. Richard's words speaking across 9 decades. Make my wealth matter. Make your life matter. Remember that the difference between them is everything that counts. Christopher turned off the lights and locked the door. Outside, Riverside slept under winter stars. The same stars Richard had studied from his observatory. The same stars that had guided Christopher and his children to Vault 4. The same stars that would shine long after all of them were forgotten. But perhaps they wouldn't be entirely forgotten. Perhaps the Foundation would endure, and the scholarships would continue, and the businesses would flourish, and the buildings would stand, and the veterans would find support, and the children would discover that art and science and history and service could be their treasures too. Perhaps that was what inheritance really meant. Not the transfer of wealth, but the transfer of values, the passing forward of purpose, the gift of opportunity to prove yourself worthy through what you chose to build. Christopher drove home through empty streets, past the scholarship recipients' homes, past the businesses the incubator had funded, past his grandfather's library still serving the community after 80 years. He thought about Richard Montgomery and his grandfather and Harold and all the people who'd tried to leave something meaningful behind. He thought about his children asleep in comfortable beds, in a house they could afford, dreaming dreams they could now pursue. He thought about the impossible thing they'd attempted and somehow achieved, about the treasure they'd found, and the treasure they were building, about the 90 years between Richard's hope and Christopher's fulfillment. Sometimes the impossible things were just the ones nobody else had courage to try. Sometimes wealth was responsibility. Sometimes failure taught what success could not. Sometimes the light did touch the darkness, and when it did, patterns emerged that had been waiting all along to be seen. The Montgomery legacy would endure, not because of the money — money could always be lost — but because they'd chosen to make it matter, because they'd proven themselves worthy not through blood, but through deed, Because when tested, they'd chosen service over selfishness, building over hoarding, opportunity over security. That was Richard's real treasure. That was what Christopher would pass to his children. That was what would last long after the vaults were empty and the estate was dust and the stars themselves had shifted in their courses. The work of making wealth matter never ended. But tonight, driving home through a town that was learning to thrive instead of merely survive, Christopher Anderson felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. He felt worthy of the chance he'd been given.